happen to be here.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Gonzalez, and I'll be speaking about Mexican economic policies and the underlying forces of corruption. So first, I'd like to just give you a brief overview of sort of how Mexico has gotten into this state of their economy today. So pre the political party, how they acted as a catalyst for Mexico's economic woes, the economic zones that were developed, how NAFTA is incorporated, both the formal and informal economies, social and economic inequality, and finally, the cartels and the corruption. So, the Institutional Revolutionary Party was formed in 1929, and their public goal was to work collaboratively with all the other political parties, but their true goal was to take complete control of the government, and they were able to accomplish this, which led to a period of 70 straight years with PRI in power. And at one point, they held every single political position for 17 straight years. So what this really started to develop was the corruption and the cronyism that still persists in Mexico's government today. And also, this man right here, Lázaro Cárdenas, was influential in developing the socialistic and nationalistic policies that have really been detrimental to the Mexican economy. He was most notable for developing Petróleos Mexicanos and centralizing the oil industry. So one thing that Mexico has done over the past 50 years or so is focused all their investment and spending on a few of the largest states in the country. So for example, in 2014, the three largest states in Mexico received 54% of foreign direct investment, over $120 billion. And out of the 32 states, their bottom 27 received a combined $60 billion. So as you can tell, all this spending is focused completely in these major, large states, and the government is completely neglecting the rest of the country. And the domestic spending parallels the foreign spending as well, like I just mentioned. Now, in addition, the government has decided to solely focus on a few major industries as well within these states. So automotive, manufacturing, industrial dominate the spending and production, in addition to the reliance on the oil industry. Now, we were able to study Guadalajara, which is known as the Silicon Valley of Mexico, which houses hundreds of technology companies, major industrial firms, and it's interesting that the government last year only spent 0.4% of GDP on research and development. Now, these are the companies that are known for their high growth, high development, so I believe the government is content with their control over these industries, not trying to have them develop or risk losing control over these industries that they spend so much money and invest so much in. So this is just a graph of FDI over the past 4 years in each of the states in Mexico. As you can tell, the largest states, the Federal District, the State of Mexico, and Jalisco, which is Guadalajara, absolutely dominate each year in FDI. And it's not coincidental that the states that receive virtually no money whatsoever also rank highest in poverty, corruption, violence, and cartel activities. Now, one reason that the Mexican government may have decided to continue to only focus on these few sectors was due to the introduction of NAFTA. Now, since its introduction in 1991, it has destroyed the Mexican agricultural sector, costing thousands of jobs to the farmers there. GDP per capita has only risen 1% since its introduction, and poverty levels are virtually unchanged. So, with these farmers losing their jobs, they have no other type of education to try and pursue other careers. We were also able to visit a couple of the largest markets in Guadalajara, which gave me a good insight into how the informal economies and formal economies work in the country. So, in these markets, there are tens of thousands of small businesses that all own a stand, and it has to be registered and licensed with the government. But one problem is that they're incredibly difficult to monitor. So, from the local level of government, these businesses either don't report because they don't want to pay taxes, or they're selling illegal products and don't want to let the government know about this. There's also thousands of unregulated street vendors. So they go around either with their taco stands or selling flowers on the street, and it's impossible to get these people to be incorporated into the actual formal economy or pay taxes. We are also able to visit a community called Mesa Colorada, which is one of the poorest communities outside of Guadalajara. And it's really clear, even on a more localized level outside of Guadalajara, how little the government assists the poor communities. There's complete lack of infrastructure. They didn't even have roads. They had one small school that was not very good. So there's a major discrepancy between the rich and the poor and how much support they receive throughout the country. Now also, many of us know about the issues with the cartels, but I believe most of us understand them as more of a social issue with the violence and the kidnappings, all those problems, but it's also important to note the economic influence that the cartels have. So the drug trade employs hundreds of thousands of individuals and funnels billions of dollars into the Mexican economy. Now, one of the problems is that these cartels are bribing lots of government officials, so it's really difficult to try and implement policies that get rid of the cartels. In addition, if they were to be completely eliminated, then all this money, billions of dollars, would be removed from the economy, which would be almost equivalent to removing one of the industries like automotive or industrial, which could decimate the economy. Now, remittances are also important because they do provide spending in the economy. However, it's all short-term spending, which cannot lead to any long-term growth in the economy. So, with all the problems that are occurring in Mexico, I'd like to offer a few possible solutions that could help improve the economy. So first, the Mexican government needs to improve education, infrastructure, and training among the poor Mexicans. Right now, they have no support whatsoever. They don't possess skills to obtain good, high-paying jobs, which would give them the ability to spend more money or potentially pay more taxes, which is a more significant source of revenue. In addition, the government needs to increase the regulation in the informal economy. If they utilize these businesses and incorporate them into the formal economy, they can give them the same rights and privileges and benefits that like the other formal businesses have, which would allow development and growth for these businesses and a major source of revenue. Also, what I believe is most important is Mexico has to decentralize their economic policies. Right now, oil, telecommunications, multimedia, they're all single monopolies. So there's no competition. They have the ability to fix all the prices. So if the government decentralizes these companies, allows competition, it will drastically increase demand, decrease prices, and allow millions more Mexican people to consume these products and be implemented into the economy. And finally, Mexico needs to diversify the industries it relies on. So right now with their 3 or 4 industries they rely on, it's very likely that if one of them were to fail, it would absolutely destroy the economy. If they utilize the resources in the remaining 27 or so states, they'll give them the opportunity to diversify, not be so heavily reliant, and so open to these devastating effects by losing one certain industry. They could also potentially try and reinvest in their agricultural sector. Now, it could be an issue of trying to adjust NAFTA or subsidizing farmers more heavily, but with some sort of combination of these solutions, I really truly believe that the Mexican economy can get out of this stagnant period and find true, steady, sustainable growth in the future. So with that, thank you for your time. Have any questions? Or let's wait for questions.
We'll wait until the thank you.
All right. Good morning. My name is Barbour. As Professor Skidmore pointed out, for those of you that were able to attend the keynote speaker last night, this is kind of going to be an extension of what Valerie Hudson was talking about. I actually wrote this paper before I knew she was coming to this conference, but I used one of her theories for my paper. And here we are. Okay, so I I used Valerie Hudson and her co-author Andrea Denbour's theory of bare branches. They wrote this theory in 2005, and I'm going to go into more detail about what bare branches, what that subsection of the population is. But they wrote this theory in 2005, and they theorized that we should be seeing the societal implications that they predicted would happen 10 years out. We should start to definitely see the domestic implications, but we should start to see the international implications. And then 20 years out, we should expect to see China and India engaging in interstate war. So what I did was apply this theory to China and India today, nearly 11 years after the original theory was published, to see if we are seeing those trends starting to manifest. And I'm going to go into more detail about what the theory is and what bare branches are. But ultimately what I found was Valerie Hudson and Andrea Denbour were largely accurate in their theory. We are definitely starting to see the domestic implications of this population start to occur in China and India, but at least 10 years out, I would argue that the international implications may be the opposite of what they had seen, or at least not as drastic as they had seen. So we're going to start at the beginning to learn what bare branches are. So ultrasound technology became widespread throughout Asia in the mid-1980s. By the 1990s, sex-selective abortion was widely used as a practice. The cultural preference for sons already existed in many of these countries. It exists in many countries throughout the world. But in China and India specifically, there were many tools used to rid society of girl children. But with the development of ultrasound technology, parents could abort a female fetus before they came to term, so they could control their reproduction more easily. They can control if they have male children more easily. Other practices that have been used to dispose of girl children are malnourishment, maltreatment of infant girls, and of course infanticide. These are encouraged by the cultural practices of the society, and that is what Ms. Hudson and Denbour argue is the problem in India. In China, of course, this has been exacerbated by Chinese policy, their one-child policy specifically, which they have reversed, though not completely. They've extended it more to a two-child policy. But still, it was exacerbated drastically by this policy, which was implemented to curb their massive population growth, but it had unintended consequences. So this has all led to these sex-selective abortions and other mechanisms to dispose of girl children. This has led to 66 million missing women in China and 43 million missing women in India. Now, these are not women that have been kidnapped and are trafficked around the world. These are not women that are literally missing people that have been reported to the police. These represent the women that should be in society that are simply not there. They do not exist. Okay, so currently, China's sex ratio at birth, so this is the boys to girls that are born every year, is 115 boys to every 100 girls. India's is a slightly smaller, 112 boys to every 100 girls. The naturally accepted rate, though this is disputed, at birth is 105 boys to every 100 girls born. The population sex ratio, as Valerie Hudson pointed out last night, is about 98 men to 100 women, but that is largely due to the fact that women live longer in every society in the world. But at birth, we should expect naturally somewhere between 101 boys to 105 boys or girls to every 100 boys and girls. That difference, 5 to 0, is accepted as natural. So what this does, these vastly different sex ratios at birth in China and India compared to what is considered natural, this creates a subclass of men in the society that are unable to find wives. And marriage is considered a measure of success in China and India. It's a cultural expectation that you are deemed successful by society regardless of wealth when you marry. These are some cultural trends that are starting to shift in China, but it's still widely accepted. Survey data shows it's still widely accepted that marriage is a key component of being considered successful. In India, we haven't really seen this trend change much. So this class of men that are unable to find wives. This is the Chinese term for them, which I'm not going to attempt to pronounce, but it translates to bare branches. So bare branches are branches of the family tree that will never produce fruit because they will never be able to marry and reproduce. They will never have children. So this large subclass of men that are unable to find wives, this has created a marriage squeeze in China and India, which is very problematic. So the Institute of Development Research in Paris found that the current sex ratios at birth, if they continue at the rate they are today, so if it doesn't increase at all, if it stays 115 boys to every 100 girls and 112 boys to every 100 girls, that by 2050, China will have over 168 single men for every 100 single women. So this is a huge population that are unable to find wives, not because they're undesirable in some way, because there are literally not enough women for them to marry. And it would be 180 single men to every 100 single women in China. So what this means, men with advantages, money, skills, education, societal status, those are the men that will be marrying. Men without advantages, the poor, the unskilled, the illiterate, men that did not have the chance to go get an education, they will not marry. So by 2020, 12 to 15% of young adult male population will be bare branches. So in 4 years, that's a huge subsection of the population in both India and China. It's about 12% in India, up to 15% in China. This is a huge percent of the population, and it's largely unskilled, poor, illiterate, or very uneducated men who are considered unsuccessful by their own cultural standards. So this is a chart that represents the marriage squeeze here on the left. So the blue lines are both India, and the orangish red lines are both China. So the worst case scenario are the two top lines. So these lines represent if the birth or the sex ratio at birth continues to increase how it has over the past 20 years, that's the worst case scenario. That is the amount 180 and slightly less than 180 men, single men to every 100 single women. Now, best case scenario, which would be as if tomorrow we woke up and the sex ratios in China and India had all automatically gone back to natural, which is not likely to happen. But say they both countries implement policies that in the next 5 years they can get their sex ratios back to normal. This is the best case scenario. So that again is the orangey red line. So still in China, it goes down drastically. It does. And same case for India. In the dark blue line, it does go down, but we see it's still 120, 150, maybe 18, 15 single men to every 100 single women. So even if the unlikely happens and we go completely back to normal sex ratios in the morning, there will still be a marriage squeeze in China in 5 years. And it will continue through the current, the generation that will be born tomorrow. It will continue until they're ready to get married. So again, this is a problem. This is a recognized problem. The bare branches are largely of low socioeconomic status, they're uneducated, and they're considered unsuccessful. And this typically means that they don't have much ties to the community. If you're considered unsuccessful by your family, that's a little bit of an ostracization. But if they're considered unsuccessful by their communities, there's not a place for them in the community. They don't have the status that would allow them to remain there and grow old there and raise their children there. So Hudson and Denbour's theory suggests that there will be many consequences to this population in both India and China, and this is extended to every country that has a bare branch population, but we're using India and China as case studies because they have two of the largest populations in the world, and they have huge bare branch populations. So what their theory suggests is that we should see high rates of crime, civil unrest, and movement against the government, because these populations are unsatisfied, considered unsuccessful, and unskilled and unable to gain any real economic mobility. Also, this is the security angle of their theory. They suggest that we should see China and India and other countries with large bear branch populations engaging in aggressive foreign policy. The idea being that China and India need a way to get rid of their bear branch population because they pose a threat to domestic stability. The idea is that China and India would be more likely to engage in interstate war because when countries go to war, their armies are typically made up of these types of people: unskilled, uneducated, low-income men. And since that is the population they're worried about, their theory suggests that we should see them engaging in more aggressive interstate conflict and more aggressive foreign policy in general because they need some way to prevent the destabilization at home. So they will send their bear branches to war to kill them off. So I looked 10 years later today and to see if we could see these trends starting to manifest themselves in real life. What I found in crime, looking at crime rates, crime in China is increasing dramatically. This information in both China and India, but especially China, is very hard to get. The government does release statistics on these trends, but they are largely inaccurate for political reasons, of course, and there's many years that are just missing, that they just don't choose not to give any data. So I compared the rates that China and India report themselves with international organizations, such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the UN, and I used specifically the United Nations Population Fund. They look at crime rates, so I compared those and found largely that China and India both very much underscore how bad their crime rates are, but they both acknowledge at least that crime rates are increasing across China and India. In China, migrants can commit 50% of urban crimes. Now this is all crimes. This includes like petty theft up to very violent murder. But bear branches are very likely to be migrants because they don't have the ties to their community and they need to find work, and because they are unskilled and poor, they need to travel to find work. Violent crimes are increasing in general, but violent crime against women is increasing as well. Warren Hudson's theory says that we should see not only crime increase, but we should see specifically violence against women increase. And then in China, there's been an 82% rise in crimes involving firearms and bombs. There's also been a sharp increase in juvenile and organized crime. And there's also been an increase in movement against the government. And this information is incredibly hard to come by. China does not produce this data themselves. There are researchers within China that have gotten government funding that are doing incredible studies on crime rates in their own country. And I got a lot of the information from those studies. In India, again, we're seeing crime rates increase across the country. There's widespread organized crime and corruption, and there's been a sharp increase in homicide in the past 10 years. It goes up every single year. There's also an increase in violent crimes and crimes against women. Civil unrest, again, we're seeing civil unrest increase in both countries. In China, in 1993, there were 8,700 reports of civil unrest. And these are China's numbers, so I'm not using international numbers. So it's likely that these numbers may be not as high as people would see on the ground. But even China shows that they have seen a drastic increase in levels of civil unrest. By 2010, there was 90,000 reports of civil unrest across the country. Now, these are not huge Hong Kong level protests, but any civil unrest, any movement against the government, even by putting posters up around the community anonymously, is reported in these numbers. But it shows this level of dissatisfaction with the government that has mirrored the growth of the bear branch population. And then the Mean Revolution in China, that was a revolution. It happened in the 1800s, but this revolution was largely made up of bear branches. China has always had a problem with a bear branch population because this cultural preference for sons has always existed. So before ultrasound technology was widely available, the other practices to dispose of girl children were still used. So this revolution, they took over the northwestern China. They took over nearly 100,000 miles worth of territory before they were quashed by the government. It was extraordinary. And this is when the Bear Branch population was about a fourth, maybe a fourth of what it is today. And that's the level of civil unrest that they were able to create in the country. In India, we do see civil unrest increasing across the country, and there is a huge anti-corruption movement against the government, and this is largely led by Bear Branch populations that are unhappy with the lack of economic opportunities for them. So in response, China's budget for domestic security increases every year. We know this. But their budget for internal security has been larger than their military budget for 5 years now. They are devoting far more resources to maintain internal security than they are external security, which is extraordinary because their external security budget, their military budget, is also increasing. So that is a demonstrator of they recognize that they do have serious domestic threats that they want to try to deal with. In 2013, the budget for domestic security was 769 billion yen. In India, there has been nearly 3 decades of policing reform to weed out corruption, increase effectiveness of government, and increase people's trust in the police force. And this is largely as a result of the anti-corruption movement that was led by the Bear Branches that we just discussed. So the security implications that Hudson and DeBoer predict, I already touched on this a bit, but we should see that China and India are engaging in interesting conflict. They use Taiwan and Kashmir as examples of where we should expect to see China and India engaging in conflict. Kashmir and Taiwan also have very large Bear Branch populations. I'm going to move through this a little quickly because I'm running out of time. But I looked at Kashmir now, 11 years after this theory was put forth. And what I found is that this is not as good of data as I could find on Taiwan, but I did find that the conflict in Kashmir is far from over. It's incredibly complicated and it goes far beyond Bear Branches. However, Prime Minister Modi of India, he is visiting Pakistan this year, which is extraordinary. It's the first time an Indian Prime Minister has visited Pakistan since 2004. As well, the Indian Prime Minister and the Pakistani Prime Minister met in Paris, which was a historic meeting at the Paris climate talks last year. And then their national security advisors met in secret during the climate talks in Bangkok to discuss, among a wide range of topics, the issue of Kashmir. And the 2014 elections in Kashmir are looking promising. Over 65% of eligible voters participated. There was a peaceful transfer of power. There was no widespread riots or violence, and it's important to note, I think, that Kashmir elected its first female leader. In Taiwan, this is a much more interesting examination, I think. China announced that their military will be reduced by 300,000 soldiers. This is significant. It's of course for modernization purposes, which we should expect because their military is very large, but it's not incredibly modern. However, if their goal was to get rid of their branch population, you would not be reducing the military because those 300,000 soldiers represent 300,000 Bear Branches that could potentially be disposed of in a conflict. As most of us know, the presidents of China and Taiwan met last year. This is the first time that the leaders of these two countries have met in 60 years. There was also an exchange of spies that each country had been holding each other's spies in prison. There was an exchange of spies. And it's likely that their shared economic interest could be the driving factor of this increased political cooperation. And perhaps that the economic interest will outweigh the potential to get rid of that population of Bear Branches. So in conclusion, I found that 10 years after the original theory was published, much of the theory is accurate. Crime and civil unrest are increasing across India and China at very dramatic rates. The security implications of this population may be more internal than Hudson and DeBoer had originally anticipated. Now, like I said at the beginning, they believed that this was likely to not manifest itself for at least 20 years. However, 10 years out, halfway through, we can start to see maybe there's political change in Taiwan and Kashmir and other, and those were the two areas that the Hudson War predicted that China and India would be likely to go to war over. Also, it's important to note that both China and India have publicly recognized the problems that their branches pose to their societies, and China is taking active steps to try to curb this massive population growth. Part of that is changing one-child policy to their two-child policy. Part of that is trying to create economic opportunities in the southern part, or not southern, excuse me, western part of the country that has largely been exempt from the economic modernization that the coastal areas of China have been experiencing. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
But first, can everybody hear me? So it's going to be walking around and I'm bad with microphones. It's just embarrassing. For those who can't see / read my horrible handwriting, I'll be going into that a little bit more detail in a second. I did also major in circle drawing, so I apologize for my abbreviated ellipses. But good morning, my name is Cecilia Panella. I'm a senior here at Drake University. And what I'm going to be dealing with specifically are going to be the theories of realism and liberalism in international relations in regards to Gamal Nasser's rise to power until his eventual death in 1970. So as far as what we need a little bit of background first. June 23rd of 1952, Gamal Nasser and General Mohammed Nagib end up overthrowing current Egyptian King Farouk on charges that his imperialist government was catering specifically to British and American influences. Now, what's important to remember about this is that Nasser doesn't start his rule off right here. He actually takes on a very, very important supporting role with Nagib in power for about 2 years until 1954, when Nasser himself ends up consolidating power under a revised Egyptian parliamentary system. This continues as such with Nasser as sort of the safeguard against the Egyptian public until 1956, when he ends up consolidating power into what we currently understand Nasser as a brilliant Egyptian dictator. Because of his abilities to institute land reform in Egypt, negotiate very, very difficult regional conflicts, as well as create a bulwark against American and British imperialism at the time, Nasser's rule is able to be consolidated with relatively little competition until his eventual death in 1970. Now, multiple scholars have studied Nasser's rise to power, his continuance to be able to sustain that power structure, and his remarkable ability to effectively stomp out any unrest. But the traditional understanding of that rise to power is a very, very problematic thing. What we understand as that rise to power is that it's linked entirely on something called realism. Now, what realism argues in international relations theory is four major things. One, that all states exist in a system of anarchy. What that means is, unlike the American government, where every single state government reports to the federal government, which rests sovereignty in the Constitution, i.e., there's a pyramid symbol of hierarchy within the nation, there's no such thing in international politics. It's every state for themselves. Second, that states are unitary actors. The leader of a specific nation is simply a safeguard for the interests of that nation. And third, the interests of that nation are primarily concerned with power, the attrition of power, power maintenance, which all manifest themselves in the expression of national security. Finally, the assumption is that these states are rational actors, that they will assess a problem based entirely off of costs and benefits, and make those decisions based upon domestic security interests that may be based in rational choice theory. Now, what we see with Nasser's revolution in 1952 is that he saw the invading British forces, the current ruling British forces, as a threat to Egypt's national security. He saw it as a threat to their domestic security, and he saw that Egypt wasn't acting in a unified, monolithic manner. So, as a result of the revolution, what we see, the traditional understanding, is that Nasser's intent and Nasser's actions are motivated specifically by this realist theory, meaning that he was a rational actor who made a decision based upon the security interests of his country, and as a result, the 1952 revolution, followed by his 1954 rise to power and his 1956 ultimate consolidation, result in this idea of pan-Arab sentiment that ends up sort of sustaining Nasser's rule until his death in 1970. However, here's where I see a crucial disconnect. You can't be dealing specifically with security and look at one revolution and expect to come up with this idea of this transnational sentiment that breaks nearly every rule of realist theory ideals. Now, what pan-Arabism is for the purposes of this discussion is the idea that across the Arab states there's a unifying factor. What Nasser does, which is very, very unique, is he doesn't just create this. He builds it from the ground up and taps into it in very, very specific ways. I'll be dealing with specifically the Suez Crisis in 1956 and Nasser's response to Patrice Lumumba's assassination in the Congo in 1961 in order to explain this. So, how did we get here? What we're really dealing with is not just realism in Nasser resulting in this pan-Arab sentiment that ends up somehow uniting the Arab world against these Western imperialist forces. We're dealing with something a little bit more complex. However, the point of the matter still remains that the 1952 revolution realism still holds true. Yes, Nasser is acting in the interests of Egypt's domestic security. He's expelling what he sees as an external threat, consolidating the power of Egypt, and as a result is consolidating his rule in a way that shows the people that they can unify in such a manner that Egypt as a national state can thrive. However, the next 20 years of his rule can't be explained by this. So what we have to do is look specifically at the case of the 1956 Suez Canal crisis. How many of you have heard that before? Yay, excellent. All right. I won't go into too much of a background on that. However, the point of the matter is in 1956, the Egyptian government nationalizes, meaning takes back, the Suez Canal. As a result, British and French forces invade. Now, why is this significant? The British were the original people who were holding the Suez Canal. Well, you have to look at Nasser's involvement in Algeria. At this point, Algeria is a French colony. Nasser comes out publicly in support of Algerian independence against France, something that isn't necessarily in his domestic national interest to do, something that isn't explained by realism. It's not in his interest to come out in favor of a colony against two of the most powerful Western powers of the time. So what's motivating this? The answer is simple, it's pan-Arabism. What Nasser is doing is he's tapping into this common Arab sentiment. He's tapping into the commonality that he sees between the Algerians as a French colony and the Egyptians as a British colony. By coming out in public support of the Algerians, what Nasser is doing is creating two incredibly powerful and incredibly angry enemies the French and the British. And for those of you who know that the French and British have rarely teamed up unless you're looking at specifically World Wars I and II, this is kind of a big deal for a former colony. What you really end up looking at in this specific situation is the fact that France is not just coming back to attack Britain or coming back to attack Egypt, but they're coming back just to attack the sentiment, the unifying idea, the outreach of Nasser to the Algerian government that is going on in this specific situation. So what we have to look at here is that by tapping into this common identity, what Gamal Nasser is doing is transcending national borders, something that can't be explained by realism because it specifically deals with the internal workings of the state, this domestic security policy. So now what we have to do is we have to turn to something a little bit different called liberalism. Now, liberalism takes realism, says really it's descriptive of what's going on at the time, yes, but it doesn't explain why states do what they do. And it also doesn't explain the significance of non-state actors. What liberal theory argues is that, one, non-state actors, such as NGOs or specific diplomats themselves, actually can have an incredibly powerful effect on international relations. Meaning to say that the way the state works isn't necessarily just as a unitary actor, but it's made up of several different moving components within that state. Secondarily, different influences like economics can play a very, very strong role. Now you have to remember, for realism, the single most powerful motivator, really the only motivator for the state, is the attrition and maintenance of power. What the liberal says is not necessarily that power politics is not important, but rather that there are other factors involved. Now, if you combine this with the Suez crisis, and you combine this with the idea of Nasser's liberal sentiment, what you're dealing with is this conglomeration of a man who's gained power vis-a-vis realist theory. He's gained power and founded that revolution upon the basis of national security, but he's adjusting himself to a rapidly liberalizing world that sees economics, namely the US dollar, as the driving power force at the time, and is accommodating his rule to adjust to that. Now, the most powerful example we see of that is 1961 in the Congo. Now, most of you know, if you've taken a US interventionism class, the US did something rather unfortunate in 1961 by assassinating Patrice Lumumba. The most interesting thing about that is, even up until this point, Abdel Nasser comes out in support of the Congo and support of Lumumba. This is exactly similar to the same cases that happened in Algeria, and something that Nasser greatly identifies with the Egyptian people. Once again, he is moving away from this domestic security policy. He's going towards a more international aspect of thinking, and he's combining those sentiments, reaching out to other Arab countries that might not necessarily be in his country's best security interests. But what he's doing is strengthening that sentiment, he's strengthening that identity politic, and he's strengthening that ideal. By coming out against the US assassination of Lumumba, once again, Nasser is making an incredibly powerful enemy, something that 1952 Nasser would never have done. It simply wouldn't have been in his interests. And for these reasons, what I end up looking at is the idea that Gamal Abdel Nasser simply can't be explained via real politics. He can't be explained vis-a-vis the traditional dictator politics that we see when we assume that men who assume power do so for power, glory, and money. What we're really looking at is a man who is able not only to consolidate his power in a 4-year term from 1952 to 1956, but we're looking at a man who consistently maintained that power and, more critically, adapted that power to suit the revolving economic relations in this world. So as a result, we cannot say simply Gamal Abdel Nasser was a dictator, was a realist, was a man consumed by power, but rather his realism in the 1952 revolution drove him to develop liberal situations in liberal thinking, to ultimately consolidate into a pan-Arab sentiment that would combine the two, this idea of a greater power beyond the borders of the state, and this idea of the control and maintenance of the economy and the power of pan-Arab sentiment, in order to create a powerful unifying factor that is still felt from 1970 and his death forward to today. Thank you.
So, question from the audience, and it's all
Mr. Gonzalez, what would you think would happen if marijuana was going to legalize, crushing cartels?
In the United States,
No, in Mexico, what effect would it have in Mexico?
personally, I don't think it would have as great an effect because the real way that these drug cartels are making their money is through the U.S. consumers. Somewhat through marijuana, but more now so through cocaine and heroin. So if it was legalized, the Mexican people aren't their primary consumers. So I don't believe it would have that much of an impact.
Would the legalization structure provide them with some way to become a legitimate businessmen instead of criminals?
No, I don't believe so. I don't think that the sentiment between the government and the cartels is equal enough where that they could come to terms with some sort of structure like that, even if the cartels decided to only specialize in, say, marijuana.
Hi, I have two questions. First, how exactly did NAFTA decimate, like, Mexico's agriculture sector? Like, what in that treaty really, like, brought it down? And then also, I believe the PRI has been, I think it was voted out in power like 2000, 2001, if I recall correctly. So why hasn't, like, the new political party or parties, done something?
So with the first question, when NAFTA was introduced, it gave the U.S. and Mexican farmers, well, it wasn't a free trade agreement, but because U.S. farmers were subsidized so heavily by the government, the Mexican farmers couldn't compete. They weren't equally subsidized. So all the demand went from, not just from Mexican farmers, but was almost completely reverted to American farmers because of the cheaper products. And the second question, there were two terms where the other, I believe it was Pan, they had held two terms after that 70-year reign or so, or in the early 2000s. However, Nieto is actually technically part of PRI, so they came back in power. They were able to develop so much power and control throughout that 70-year period that it'd be very difficult for them to just kind of fade away. And there hasn't really been, until Pan, a true contender to that power.
Right, I think this is the same thing like the LDP in Japan, where they were in power so long, and even when they got voted out, they just came back later. So, yeah. Thank you.
So Cecilia, what was it that led you to choose the case studies for Nasser that you chose? Really choosing the Congo over discussing Nasser's role in outlining it?
Well, I actually end up covering Syria and his role in the tripartite aggression a lot more thoroughly in the actual essay itself. But due to the 10-minute time limit and the fact that I don't shut my mouth, I decided to focus specifically just on the Congo and on the Suez Canal because I thought those cases were more popular and would have a little bit more of a historical context for the audience.
Thanks. Yeah, I got a question for Haley. So you said that the marriage is considered a measure of success in China and India. You said it's changing somewhat in China. Do you know why that is exactly, why that's starting to change in China but not necessarily in India?
Actually, I go into more detail in the actual paper, and I would have if I had more time today. But there's this cultural trend in China that is happening alongside this marriage squeeze. So at the same time that there's this huge population of men who are unable to find wives, there's also been this cultural shift in the current generation and the generation of children probably will experience the same thing. Among women in China, women are getting married later and later. It's becoming far more common for women to go to college, to get degrees, to get postgraduate degrees before they consider marriage. So that cultural trend alongside this marriage squeeze is only exacerbating the problem. So the cultural change in China is actually maybe not for the best, because it's changing. The idea of success is changing because now we have women especially going on to get degrees and establish careers and establish their own wealth, independent of a husband, because they're not getting married. So that's kind of the change we're seeing. That's why it's not necessarily marriage isn't tied to success as much, but for a poor, unskilled man living on the countryside, it still very much is. In India, we are starting to see, again, women getting married later, but it's not happening to the extent that it's happening in China, in South Korea, and in Japan. This is a trend that we're seeing all over East Asia, of women getting married later and later.
Thank you.
Hi, so this question could really be touched on by any one of you, so this is kind of a free-for-all. How, in your research, how do you see the role of international institutions coming into what we were looking at?
Yeah. I don't know, that's a good question. I guess most of the research I focused on was more of a domestic issue with some of the problems that Mexico caused themselves that they would then in turn have to reverse or fix. So I guess one of the international players would be the U.S. with their involvement in NAFTA and how that affected the Mexican economy. Other than that, I guess I could argue some of the companies and their foreign direct investment by playing along with kind of the government's interests in focusing on a few major states and not really investing in the country as a whole was primarily.
There is a lot of influence that international institutions have had on the issue of fair branches in China and India, but China specifically, because it has been international institutions and academics across the world that have brought to light this problem of having this large subclass of the population who are unable to marry the fair branch population. And that has, that along with the creation of norms about gender-specific abortion is not acceptable as much as it maybe had been in the 1990s when it became widespread across China. It has led China to put research into their own, domestic academics to try to research this problem and come up with creative solutions that the government can implement to try to prevent this population from continuing to grow and eventually curb its growth, or stop its growth. So it has been directly the pressure of international institutions and international actors that have kind of made China change its policies, and we're starting to see that in India, but they've acknowledged it as a problem. They haven't made as many concrete steps to try to combat the problem.
From my research, the biggest thing is from the oil companies. If you look at the conflict in the Middle East, what you're really dealing with, especially with Suez, that canal is still one of the main areas of transport for the world's petroleum sources. If you look at the Congo and you look at Algeria and you look at the way that Nasser's politics is shaping, what you're dealing with is multinational ports. You're dealing with huge amounts of money coming through, and you're specifically dealing with the world's most, the world's hottest commodity. So the biggest thing that I ended up looking at my research, as far as international institutions goes, was definitely the oil companies and the oil industry itself and its effect on Nasser and his machinations beyond that.
Hi, I'm very interested in the second presentation, and because I'm Chinese, so the issue you have talked about not only is an issue on textbook or in newspaper, still it's an issue in our everyday lives. And I agree with you that the sex ratio in China really is a very serious issue. What I wanted to say, I have a few points here I would like to share with you. And first is that I think we may take a look at the history. So what does the history tell us about this issue? And because you have mentioned that the some efforts, this piece of culture has existed in China for many, many years, probably in 2000s or even longer. So I think China, the sex ratio in China, in 3 decades ago, when the one-child policy was enforced, at that time, sex ratio was unbalanced. I think the statistics can confirm that. So when we think about the unbalanced sex ratio unbalanced today in China, I think it may help us to understand how much worse the policy has made it. But the China has never been so perfect. I mean, with regard to sex ratio. And the other piece is that because of in Chinese history, I think that although I don't have the number for it, I think that the bare branches, the number may be pretty high in our history because it is quite prevalent that in the rural country, many men will never get married in their life, and the rich men will take quite a few concubines. So I think the marriage squeeze existed for many years. So my thinking now is that this is not a new problem to Chinese society, and but the severity of this problem I think is heavier than the history. And the other issues I want to share with you that I think I haven't read Dr. Hudson's book about this issue. I'm very interested in it, and also the conclusion the book draws is not brand new, I will say, although I'm sure she has made contributions to this topic. On the relationship between the unbalanced sex ratio and the possibility of the war, I think, but I would like to highlight that I think the issues may be much more complicated. For example, the civil unrest in China, I'm a sociologist, so I would highlight the factors of the gap between the rich and the poor. And the sex ratio, I don't know. So my thinking right now is that how much significance is the cause from the sex ratio, unbalanced sex ratio, if the gap between the rich and the poor is so high, even if, may I say, if the sex ratio is balanced, how about the crime rate? Will it drive crime rates very quickly? Because the index for the gap between the rich and the poor is the Gini index, right? And during the past few years, the Chinese government doesn't release this number because it's just too high. It is higher than many countries, even in the South America, which we consider the gap is pretty high. So I think there are lots of other factors maybe also will be helpful for us to understand, for example, the civil unrest in China and the conflicts, the crime rates. I think all of those factors, maybe including sex ratio, contributes to those very disturbing phenomena in China. So that's, yeah. And what I want to highlight is I agree with you that it may be more related, it may lead to more internal conflicts than to foreign conflicts. I mean, my understanding is that unless those bare branches they want to get women from the outside country. That may cause more direct, but I think it may cause more violence against women within China. That's my thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you, and I completely would agree with you. I would never assert that this to know that all of this is happening in a much bigger context, politically, economically, culturally. And in my paper, I go into much more detail, specifically with engaging in interstate conflict or foreign conflict, that there might be political and economic considerations that China weighs that are more important to them than dealing with their immigrant population. And I think that is kind of getting at this bigger context. And absolutely, you can't assert that bear ranches are the sole reason that crime and civil unrest occur in China or India. I point them out as significant because as we have seen the population of bear ranches increase, which it has always been a problem in China and to a lesser extent India, but in the 1980s and 90s when we saw policies implemented, when we saw ultrasound technology and sex-selective abortion widely used, this population dramatically increased. But as it has increased, we've seen civil unrest and crime increase. And I note civil unrest and crime specifically because the likelihood of the civil demonstrations being led or at least largely participated by bear branches is very high. And crime rates acts of crime are often implemented by bear branch men. So that's why I note them as significant. And I don't think that eliminating bear branches would in any way solve those problems. But there's no way to do it quickly. To eliminate this bear branch population would take generations. It would take a tremendous commitment by both governments, and I don't anticipate that happening anytime soon. So it's likely that once they realize that this is a big enough problem and implement the policies 3 generations later, after the people who implement the policies have long been dead, we'll start to see those changes. But that will happen alongside other policies. So we could never know for sure if that eliminating the bear branches was directly responsible for changing the crime rates or civil unrest.
I wanted to connect, I guess, speculate about whether there's a connection between the bear practice issue and economic reform. So many Chinese economists have said that China has overcapacity in certain heavy industries, especially steel and autos, and that the returns to investment in infrastructure have declined greatly, so that the rationale for building more dams or more roads or more, it's less now than 10 or 20 years ago. And they've argued that China should move more into service industries, especially with the aging population. So this raises a couple questions for me. First of all, why does China overinvest in heavy industry or in constructing infrastructure? And why, even though China's leaders have said, we recognize this problem and we want to reform the economy and shift the investment resources into services and other new sectors, why has it been so slow to actually take place? Well, of course, China's government has been sensitive to issues of unemployment because unemployed people are unhappy and could engage in civil unrest. And some economists think that China's unemployment figures, the official figures, are artificially low, that unemployment is actually higher. But you can imagine that China's leaders would not just only look at unemployment, but be especially sensitive to male unemployment. And so they would especially be sensitive about cutting jobs in industries that are predominantly male workforce. And construction, for instance, is an industry that's predominantly male workforce. So one worry that I would have if I were a Chinese leader about, making major cuts in construction and infrastructure and heavy industry is that not only that people would lose jobs, but in particular that bear branch males would lose jobs. And then those would be a segment of the population who, should they become very dissatisfied, particularly political risk. I don't know if you've seen any discussion of this. It's just an association I made my own.
I haven't seen any concrete
Beautiful. And this question is for Cece. So I think that your analysis is incredibly valid, but I was wondering what you believe the future implications of this new analysis is important for. So what does this mean in the future when we look at dictatorships in the modern age? And how can we use this interpretation to be better and to do better and to better understand what's happening in the world?
For me, what this really represents is the idea that when we tend to look at democratic leaders, we tend to take a much more nuanced viewpoint. We don't just necessarily look at how they attain power because we assume that that methodology was legitimate. We look really, really deeply at how they maintain power and the policies that they use in the process. However, when we really look at dictators, we become so latched on to how they attain power. Was it ooh, an interesting military coup or something fancy and dramatic and, for lack of a better term, it's fashionable. But what we really don't do with a lot of those dictatorships is we don't assume that there is a greater leadership structure in place behind just that power transition. So what I really, really want to do with this research eventually is kind of take this application. Okay, Nasser has attained power via XYZ. He maintained power via ABC. How do those two translate? I want to be able to take this research and kind of apply it to multiple different dictators. I think it would also be valuable, especially for American foreign policy students, because again, a lot of the time, our focus is specifically on how do they gain power, how many people do they kill, and when do they die. Whereas, these intricate little pieces of how somebody maintained their state can be so interesting and so telling about what the future for that specific country will bring.
One more question.
Okay. Both Greg and Heidi mentioned, and there is a connection that I noticed migration. Greg, to the remittances that are sent by immigrants from Mexico from the United States to Mexico, and then the all internal migration in India and China. I wonder if the two of you or the three of you can offer some suggestions, just like Greg offered, maybe renegotiating NAFTA. Offer some suggestions about this whole issue of immigration, both internal and external.
Like American policy as far as American immigration goes? Oh boy.
Well, I can talk about China a little bit. So China has when I was in Beijing, we talked about this extensively. They have very strict laws about movement within their country for their citizens. If you have to, for example, travel to Beijing for work, you have to migrate to Beijing for work, there are laws preventing you from sending your children to school in Beijing. Your children have to go to school in where you live permanently. And it's laws like this that I think kind of could, this again is very speculative, but they could exacerbate this bear branch population. This could be a way that these bear branches are further separated from their communities, which they already don't feel a part of, but then they would have to, and they don't have children, so but that's just an example of very strict movement laws within China. So that would require China and India to change their internal movement laws. Oh, well, China, I suppose India doesn't have very strict laws. They should change those laws. They're not great laws and they're hurting a lot of people, but whether they're going to or not is probably they're not. So, but that could be a way, I suppose. I don't know what the U.S. could do at all to help China change those laws.
For me, I guess the way I look at it is, the Mexican government needs to give their people a reason to stay in the country. A lot of the people leave, at least the areas that I talked about, the really poor communities with lots of violence, to escape those problems. One of my solutions, if the Mexican government can really improve and build infrastructure in those places, invest and give them resources, I think it could potentially give those people a reason to stay in their country. One other issue is that there's the intermigration between those very poor areas to some of the larger cities that do much better economically. So that can lead to overpopulation, those people getting shunned, and basically maintaining the same lives that they had before. So I think really developing that infrastructure in some of those really poor, underdeveloped areas would be very helpful.
And building on that, you discussed political economies, the fact that NAFTA really, yes, it's a North American free trade agreement, but really the only country that benefits is the United States. NAFTA wasn't meant to sustain the population growth that Mexico has seen, and as a result, actually, if you look at, I think it's 2013 numbers, NAFTA employs fewer people than the Mexican drug trade does, which is kind of embarrassing if you think about something the United States has negotiated. I think Paul Butler talks about this. You brought it up in class earlier, Dr. Skidmore. This idea that what ends up happening is the United States is actually feeding into this idea of illegal immigration, of irregular immigration, because it's convenient for the American economy. So I think what really needs to happen in conjunction with the Mexican government giving their people a reason to stay is the American government taking a critical look at their economic policies and seeing, yes, we are a country that thrives off of capitalist profit. That's a fact. Maybe we don't need to change that as thoroughly, but we do need to readdress the actual ramifications that our policies are having on other countries. So I think that the American government needs to look past its own nose in a lot of ways. However, how I would handle that is probably not necessarily as reasonable as could actually be achieved by Congress.
Great. Thanks for getting up also